Hello, everyone. We're going to get started. Welcome to day 2 of the Canadian Science Policy Conference. My name is Zina Ladak, and I am a member of their program committee this year. So today we have an interactive panel titled Science and the Next Generation, and it's hosted by CIHR. I just want to remind everyone that if you are posting on social media and tweeting, please use the hashtag CSPC2022, and you can also tag @SciencePolicy, which is the conference handle. There's also an evaluation survey at the end of this panel and any panel throughout the conference. Please fill it out so we can improve our future conferences and events for you. And in today's panel, they will be using the app. So hopefully you've downloaded the conference app. They'll be using the polling and the Q&A function on the app in real time. And now I will hand it over to Laura Killian from CIHR.
Thanks, Zinat. My name is Laura Killian, and I'm here representing the Canadian Institutes of Health Research Institute of Human Development, Child and Youth Health. We have the privilege of having the longest of all the institute names of CIHR. Part of my role is to liaise with our Youth Advisory Council, and it's one of the most inspiring and fun parts of my job. I'm pleased today to introduce as the moderator for this all-youth panel, one of our inaugural members of our Youth Advisory Council, Eki Okunbawa. Eki's passion lies in community advocacy and empowerment, improving the social determinants of health for vulnerable families, children, and youth, and advancing equitable and evidence-based policies and practices. Eki holds a Master of Education in Educational Psychology from the University of Alberta and an Honors Bachelor of Science in Psychology from York University. During her spare time, Eki enjoys watching Marvel movies. Eki currently resides in Toronto, also known as Takaranto and Treaty 13 territory. Please welcome the moderator for this session, Eki.
Thank you so much, Lara. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to our panel for the 2022 Canadian Science Policy Conference. I hope you have all been enjoying the conference so far, with lots to learn and lots to take back to your friends, colleagues, and organizations that you're a part of. Our panel would like to begin by acknowledging that we are currently situated in the city of Ottawa, and we are gathered on the unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin peoples. We honor and recognize that the Anishinaabe Algonquin peoples have resided here and nurtured this land since time immemorial, and we are grateful to be gathered here today. We would also like to acknowledge the land that the institute that organized this panel is located. The Canadian Institutes of Health Research, Institute of Human Development, Child and Youth Health, also known as CIHR-IDSE, is located at Dalhousie University. We respectfully acknowledge that the land on which IDSE is housed is Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. As an institute with national reach, IDSE honors all Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis across Turtle Island for their past and ongoing contributions to society. This land acknowledgement also serves as a reminder of the inequities Indigenous peoples face in science and in other disciplines, many of which stem from a history of land dispossession, colonialism, and broken treaties. For us, land acknowledgements help to affirm our ongoing commitment to a more just future through equitable research and policy. We strive for respectful partnerships with Indigenous peoples on a path towards healing, reconciliation, and self-determination. We invite members of our audience today to learn about and reflect upon whose traditional territories you reside on. We hope that you will take individual and collective action towards truth and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. Thank you. So now I would like to give a couple of opening remarks before we get started with our panel presentations. As you are aware, our panel is titled Science and the Next Generation: Authentic Engagement with Youth in Science and Science Policy. This session is an all-youth panel that will highlight the different ways that diverse youth voices are influencing science and science policy. Our panel is excited and eager to share innovative ideas on how to move from participation to meaningful partnership when it comes to engaging youth in science policy and research. We have worked diligently to prepare a panel rich in information, real-life experiences, and evidence-based recommendations to enhance youth engagement in science policy and research. The quote you see on the screen, "Nothing about us without us," by James Charlton, is the pillar of our panel today. We envision a future where research and policy initiatives in science and in other disciplines are more inclusive of youth, especially in cases where youth are the target audience of a piece of work. It is our hope that you will find this session inspiring, influential, and valuable for your future work. This panel is meant to be engaging and interactive, so we have prepared some poll questions which we will share at the appropriate time. We are also excited to engage in the Q&A period with you all. To participate in the polls and to submit questions for the Q&A portion of this panel, please ensure that you have the CSPC conference app downloaded on your mobile device and submit your responses and questions there. We will begin with a poll question and then move into our panel presentations. And then after the presentations, we will go into our Q&A period where you will all have a chance to direct questions to the panelists. We will conclude the panel with closing remarks and takeaway resources that we have prepared for you all. So if you can please get your conference apps ready. So our first poll question is, which of the following best describes your engagement with youth? So please select the best response that applies to you. And you can see on the screen, results are coming in. So we have a couple for, I have engaged with or worked with youth in the past. Most people are saying, I am currently engaging with or working with youth. And then we have a couple who say, I plan to engage with or work with youth in the future. So thank you for submitting your responses to that. We'll definitely get into youth engagement in our panel presentations. And now to kick off our panel, I would like to introduce to you all our amazing panelists for today. First, I would like to introduce Max King. Max King is from Edmonton, Alberta, and he is an engineer currently working on the next generation of space exploration with MDA in Toronto. Max completed his undergraduate degree in materials engineering from the University of Alberta and has a master's in applied science from the University of Toronto in aerospace engineering. With time spent abroad, working with the German Aerospace Center and here in Canada, working on everything from CubeSats to Canadarm3, he has been a part of Canada's role in the science and space community internationally. Please welcome Max. Next, I would like to introduce Veena Mohabir. Veena has lived with chronic pain since she was a teenager after an accident in 2010. Veena is passionate about sharing her story and advocating for the unique needs of disabled, diverse, and low-income youth. She facilitates patient engagement in pain research, policy, education, and clinical practice in Canada and internationally. She currently works at the IELTS Pain Research Lab at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto. She is proud to partner with organizations like Solution for Kids in Pain, also known as SCIP, the Canadian Pain Society, the National Institutes of Health, the International Association for the Study of Pain, and the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, Strategies for Patient-Oriented Research, also known as SPORE units across Canada. It is my pleasure to introduce to you all Vina. Next, I have the pleasure of introducing Rachel Simintov. Rachel Simintov is a high school student in Calgary, Alberta. She received an NSERC Young Innovator Grant to support her school project called the Framework for Optimal Pandemic Management. This project won first prizes in the Calgary Youth Science Fair and took her project to the national competition in 2022. Using Python, Rachel simulated the impact of medical interventions on the course of COVID-19 and developed a framework to calculate the required rate of vaccination in each country, aiming to maximize the likelihood of financial sustainability and coexistence with future mutants of the virus. Her computerized framework addresses both economic and social justice considerations of pandemic response. I am pleased to introduce Rachel. Finally, I would like to introduce Sarah Mooney. Sarah is currently earning a Bachelor of Science in Nursing from MacEwan University and finishing her training as a patient and community engaged researcher at the University of Calgary. She currently sits on the CIHR Institute of Human Development, Child and Youth Health Youth Advisory Council. She is also a patient and youth partner across local, provincial, and national healthcare systems, networks, and research projects. It is my pleasure to introduce Sarah. So now we will go right into our panel presentations, beginning with Max.
Thank you very much, Eki, for that introduction. Thank you all very much for coming and joining us for this session, where we have the most interactive session I think we've seen so far. So thank you very much, Tobin, in the booth there for all the great AV work. So as Eki mentioned, my name is Max King. I'm an aerospace engineer. I'm originally from Edmonton, Alberta. And if, Eki, would you mind just progressing one slide? And on screen there is the only piece of art I own. And I don't have that up there just to say I'm a bachelor and I have something hung in my apartment. This is the reason I'm here today. This is concept art for what became the Space and Science Center in Edmonton, Alberta, now called the TELUS World of Science Edmonton. Growing up there, I went there with my siblings and my parents an uncountable number of times. And I volunteered there at an observatory for 5 years when I was doing my undergrad in engineering. I am one of those people who's always wanted to work in space ever since I figured out what stars were, or was taught what stars were. And in Edmonton and out west in Canada, it's not always entirely clear how to do that. So being from Edmonton, the space sector is always out east, be that in Canada, out here, over in Europe, or even down south into the United States. So after serving my time as an engineer in Fort McMurray, I was eventually able to work for the DLR in Germany, the German Space Agency. This was a key experience for me, and I was really privileged to be able to leave Canada in order to get direct experience in my field. I eventually moved to Toronto to pursue a master's degree in aerospace, and it was after that I was selected to be on a youth council to Canada's Chief Science Advisor, Dr. Mona Niemer. Our mandate was to bring forward key issues facing youth in our specific fields and also in science broadly in Canada. So of the several contributions we've made over the past couple years, we were formed right when COVID happened. So it's been busy. Of the several contributions we've made, there's one I want to share with you, and that's the recent release of our large report, the Our Vision for Science, a youth perspective on science moving forward in Canada. So we're not experienced enough to have known a TRIM report probably would get more readership. so it's pretty long. It's pretty broad scope. But one of the themes we wrote on a lot that I resonated with was pathways into science, pathways to science. Our charge to the reader, and by extension all of you here today, is to challenge how we see careers in science. And for me, particularly, that means the space sector. Outside of a localized region in this part of the country, a career in the space sector in Canada can seem unlikely. And so I know many talented students and young professionals who've had to leave their province, their country, and unfortunately, some have even left the field. So that's why I'm emphasizing this theme of pathways to science. One of our calls to action is to normalize the exploration of different careers within science. This is where consultation with youth is incredibly valuable. So I thank you all for being here today to consider how youth engagement is, why it is important. What does a career look like for someone entering a field? We call on those involved in academia, and we've heard it a few times, fortunately, echoed on other panels throughout this conference so far, challenging the definition of excellence. For someone entering a career in academia or entering a career in a specific field, what excellences are they looking for in their career? Or what excellences are they looking for in a supervisor, in mentorship? And it's not a lot of publication counts on that list. So youth perspective on these things can really help highlight barriers to entry or barriers to staying in, barriers to attracting that young talent. As Sophie Demour and Stephen Tope in the last session there in the Confederation Hall touched on that exact thing. Next gen attraction. How do we attract youth? Talk to youth, consult with them. Excellent place to start. As the space sector becomes increasingly impactful in our daily lives and also in the sustainment of our planet, we will benefit greatly from drawing in students and experienced professionals spanning broad areas of expertise. We don't need just people like me who knew space was for them all the time. We need that well of HQPs across the country and across their careers. As my home province of Alberta makes that essential pivot out of a fossil fuel dependent economy, we can build pathways into the space sector for all that raw talent, that engineering talent, science talent, engagement in education, and we can help expand opportunities in space out coast to coast to coast in Canada. The space industry, and I want to paraphrase the Space Agency President Lisa Campbell here, is collaboration at its best. So pathways into the space sector and science at large need to be accessible for people not just from a typical narrow undergrad, master's, PhD pipeline, but also from people transferring in their skills from other fields. I've said this to a few people at the conference so far this week. We all work in the space industry, and some of us just haven't told you yet why we need you. So the study of space is where all disciplines intersect, and we will benefit from encouraging every discipline and entry from people across all sectors. So for me in my career in how to have a varied scientific career, I've benefited greatly from an openness from my employers to have different dimensions in a scientific career. As I mentioned, I volunteered at the observatory at this science center for many years, and that solidified my love for teaching, a commitment to growing that teaching both through graduate school and beyond in my professional career has led to a continuous public outreach component to my career, engaging Canadians in what I fell in love with all those years ago. So as I said, this image on screen is why I'm here today, specifically involved in science policy. This was the concept art for what eventually became a formative experience for me, a formative force in my life. And that is what science policy is. It's the concept art, the imagining of new forces in our society to help the next generation of scientists, which some of which are up here, some of which are out there, and some of which are out there. So this is why I'm here promoting youth involvement in science policy, and especially proud to be doing it as an engineer in the Canadian space sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Max. Thank you so much for your presentation. And just a reminder to everyone that you can submit questions on the conference app at any point during the panel presentations, and we will address them during the question and answer period. And if you rather just verbally ask your question during the Q&A period, you can come up to the podium and use the mic to ask your question. Thank you. So now I will pass it on to Vina.
Thank you so much, Eki. I'm really grateful to be here, and I just want to quickly acknowledge the land in which I live and work, which is Treaty 13 in Toronto. As a child of immigrant settlers on this land, I've always been welcomed, and I encourage you all to look up the land in which you're on. So I began my journey in an ER in Toronto, and right now with capacity in ERs, it's definitely important to think about, but way back when, I had not the best care experience. I kept experiencing pain after an injury, and I was stigmatized as a racialized youth who was also a woman. I often heard that she's just a drama queen, as teenagers often are. I heard it's all in her head, and a few other things. However, even though through this incredibly isolating experience, I felt like I was the only youth who lived with pain, I learned an important fact, which is 1 in 5 children and youth in Canada live with chronic pain, and that number is the same for adults. So 1 in 5 of you in this room either lives with chronic pain or knows somebody living with pain. That's about 8 million Canadians impacted by that, and it particularly impacts marginalized youth and other vulnerable populations. This led to a lot of uses of medications like opioids and things like that, which ended up leading Health Canada and the Federal Minister of Health to form the Canadian Pain Task Force. So in 2021, an action plan for pain in Canada was published, and it was informed by evidence and involved immense pan-Canadian consultation, and a Canadian Pain Task Force was created. I'm grateful to be one of the people consulted on this action plan, especially from the perspective of a youth, racialized youth, and a youth who grew up in low to middle income class. The action plan is comprised of 150 recommendations to the government under 6 key goals. Goal number 4 is very important to me, which involves the support of and building of infrastructure while also engaging people with lived experience in building that. I was really lucky to be involved in some foundational work that led to this Canadian Pain Task Force. So the first thing I would like to talk about is my priority setting work. I was very lucky to be part of the group of youth on this project. And priority setting work is really important to create more relevant research and also decrease research waste by, again, completing more sustainable and relevant research for the populations engaging in that. So I was involved in the pediatric pain priority setting project, and we came up with the top 10 priorities for research and policy together in consultations, again, with people's lived experience, with healthcare professionals, with policymakers, researchers, et cetera. And this was all really great and awesome that we came up with top 10 research priorities. But what did this really mean when we know that people in the community are out there and they don't have the best access to evidence-based information? This is when I was introduced to the implementation gap, where it takes an average of 17 years for something that we've researched to be put into practice. And we have kids, 1 in 5 kids right now living with pain, and it's incredibly important to be treated in a timely fashion, as acute pain can often transition into chronic pain, just as I experienced. This led to the formation and funding of Solution for Kids in Pain, or SKIP, and what we do is we're a national knowledge mobilization network that has people with lived experience, researchers, policymakers, all come together to mobilize everything we know about evidence-based information in pediatric pain work. This led to my work helping to mobilize the action plan for pain in Canada and let community stakeholders, as well as patients and families, know about this action plan and learn more about how we can implement this in marginalized populations and racialized youth and Indigenous populations and more. I'm on the Patient and Caregiver Advisory Committee with SCIP, and what we did was we mobilized this work. Now, again, why does this matter? Why does an action plan matter? Well, action leads to large-scale impact. And I'm incredibly proud that last week during National Pain Awareness Week, the Government of Canada announced $5 million of funding to pain self-management programming in Canada. All of this experience built my foundation and fueled my love of research and eventual engagement, partnership, and then becoming the research. So I joined the IOUCH lab and did some graduate work, and this is me with my lab mates and at Sick Kids presenting research. And an incredibly important part of my job is youth engagement. So I'd really like to highlight an example of that, and it started with a grant funded by CAHR for something called the Kids Pain Portal. Now, the first thing these youth let me know was that, Vina, we're teenagers. This sounds stupid. I'm not going to engage with this. This doesn't sound, I'm not a kid. And I was like, you know what? You're actually right. 15-year-old Vina would not have engaged with this portal. So what we did was we worked with them to completely co-design this, which means involving them at every stage of the process. They designed the logos, chose the color scheme, and these youth are from all across Canada and represent significant diversity. So we were able to hear from youth who experienced vision impairment and learn more about how to make that more accessible, learn more about rephrasing research terms into regular terms that everyone can digest. And it was very exciting because when a certain funder heard about all our work doing this, it led to an announcement, which is going to happen in a few weeks. It was supposed to be made by now, but government. Basically, what I can tell you right now is we're currently working on co-designing this with across the lifespan. So everybody 12 plus will have access to evidence-based information, the newest work out there in digital health, in patient education, in learning everything they need to know to cope with pain. So my key message here to you today are to remember that policy and research are interlinked. You can't separate us because it's really important for policy to be informed by research. It's never a waste of your time to include youth in that work. It takes a little more flexibility. You might have to meet, during off hours. You might have to do a few other things to make sure it works, but it will change your work in ways you could never imagine and create more relevant work, sustainable work, and impactful work. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vina. Thank you. Your story is so incredibly inspiring. I'm always moved every time you share it. And it's amazing to see how you've turned your pain into purpose. And yeah, we're just really grateful for you sharing how you're making impacts in all areas of pain research. So thank you. Next, I would like to pass it over to Rachel.
Okay, hi. This works. Okay. So I'm standing here because I just have a few slides, and it might be a bit easier to look right from here to here rather than, all around. Okay. So, thank you, Eki. I'm very, very honored to be here. This is a really good experience, especially for someone. I'm 15 years old, so it's really amazing to be invited here and to be able to speak in front of so many people about my experience with science. So Eki already told you guys, but this past year I competed in science fair, both in my city science fair and in Calgary Youth Science Fair and in Canada's National Science Fair. So today I'll be talking a bit about the project that I competed with and about how we can use this project and about its impact that it has. So my project addresses social justice and how we can use science to measure inequities in the world and then policies to resolve those inequities. So at the time that I developed my project, COVID was really at its peak. And it was clear that in order for developing countries to cope with COVID, they'd have to depend on resources that come from developed countries. By resources, I mean vaccines, right? So there were these organizations, like for example, COVAX, that received vaccine donations from developed countries. And then they had to decide how they would allocate those vaccines to developing countries. They had to decide how many vaccines they give to which countries. And this is a really difficult thing to do, right? Like how can we prioritize different countries or different regions in the world over other different regions? So when it comes to social justice, we tend to sort of intuitively think that the goal should be to equalize the vaccine rates between countries, right? So for example, it would feel wrong to donate vaccines to a country with a vaccine rate of 50% if we knew that a different country only had a vaccine rate of 25%. So intuitively, we want to sort of equalize this. We want every country's vaccine rate to be equal. The thing is, our intuition isn't always correct. So the IMF, this is the International Monetary Fund, they're part of the UN. The IMF and the OECD both have COVID policy documents, and then both organizations said that the optimal way to deal with a pandemic should maximize the likelihood to coexist with the pandemic. Am I going in the right? Yes, we want to coexist with COVID. So rather than aiming to equalize the vaccine rates between countries, we should aim to equalize the likelihood for each country to reach a point of coexistence with COVID. So because different countries have different demographics, naturally the vaccine rates needed for separate countries to reach this point of coexistence will also be different. All right, great. So now we know that different countries require different vaccine rates. So how can we figure out what these different vaccine rates are? So now the question becomes, how can we determine the vaccine rate needed for each separate country in order to reach this coexistence with COVID? So my project answers this question. What I did, I coded an algorithm that shows us the required vaccine rate needed to coexist with COVID for a set demographic. And then this algorithm can be run on any country by adjusting the algorithm's inputs. So here's how the algorithm's used. I'll explain this kind of vaguely, and then I'll give some more specific examples. So once we find out where a country should aim to be, we can compare it with where they currently are. And then this way, we can see how much they have left to do before they reach their goal, before they reach the point of coexistence. And of course, we want this value to be as small as possible, right? Because a smaller value means that there's less work to do. The country's closer to achieving coexistence. So I'll give kind of more of an example now. Let's say that we ran this algorithm on hypothetical country A. We found that the optimal vaccine rate is 50%. So country A should aim to have a vaccine rate of 50%, right? So we compare this to where they currently are, to their current vaccine rate. Let's say it's 30%. And now we can see how much of the population they have left to vaccinate before they reach their goal. So how is this related to global justice? What we can do now is we can compare country A to another country. We'll call this country B. I'm very, very creative with the names here. So we can call this country B. We run the algorithm in country B, and we found that the optimal vaccine rate for country B is 80%. Again, just examples, right? So now let's say that the current vaccine rate of country B is 35%. So we see that country B actually has a really long way to go before reaching their optimal vaccine rate. So now the inequity between countries A and B is revealed. We see that country A is way, way closer to achieving coexistence with COVID than country B is, despite country B actually having a higher current vaccine rate. So now let's look at a real life example. So we'll talk about two real countries, Angola and Ghana. So by March of 2022, the two countries' vaccine rates were really similar. 18% of Angola was vaccinated, and then 16% of Ghana was vaccinated. And this seems to be very balanced, right? It seems to be pretty fair and equal. However, if we use the algorithm that we just discussed, we can calculate that Angola should aim for a vaccine rate of 40%, whereas Ghana should aim for a vaccine rate of 50%. So what do we see here? I'll actually isolate these blue squares so it's a lot easier to see. We can see that despite the countries having a similar vaccine rate, despite them having a pretty seemingly equal vaccine rate. Angola is actually way, way closer to achieving coexistence than Ghana is. And we learned that without any sort of policy to measure inequity, we'd never even know that there is an inequity to begin with. We'd never be able to act on this. So I want to stress here that this sort of contribution to science and policy and the strive for global justice isn't only relevant to this sort of like equitable vaccine donating strategy, but it's relevant to any global challenge, right? And the status quo attempts at addressing social justice can be pretty intuitive and pretty subjective. They're normally made by politicians, not by scientists. And this is certainly not the best that we can do. So my project is just one example that demonstrates the necessity of using an objective and data-driven approach in the strive for a more equitable world, and that's where science must come into play. So that's my presentation. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you so much. You always amaze me. I remember when I was in grade 10, I definitely was not at a national conference presenting on some work I did on Python. No. But you are doing amazing work. And I think you really highlighted how COVID has amplified different inequities, not just in Canada, but globally, and how science can be used to resolve some of the problems and issues that we're seeing. So thank you so much for your presentation. Next, I would like to pass it off to Sarah.
Yeah, thank you. I must say, you're definitely a tough act to follow. Yes, once again, she's incredibly impressive. So thank you so much for having me today. I'm really happy to be here. For my presentation today, I'm going to start by introducing my entry into patient engagement and youth engagement in research and policy. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about a framework, but I really want to focus on a story that I feel highlights the importance of meaningful youth engagement in policy best. So my story begins as a pediatric patient transitioning to the adult healthcare system with chronic and semi-complex health conditions. During this transition, I fell through the cracks. While I was falling through these cracks, it was when I realized that the systems and policies in place that were supposed to support me in this transition really were not developed with the youth mindset. And so I was offered an opportunity to partner on a transitions project at my local children's hospital, and I very eagerly jumped on that. Years later, through opportunity, networking, and mentorship, I branched out to provincial councils, Children's Healthcare Canada, Pediatric Inpatient Research Network, as well as my role in which I'm representing today, the longest name of CIHR, ITSE's Youth Advisory Council. So I've always known that in my career I want to pursue nursing, but it was really through these opportunities that it opened up a whole new world of my career that I never even realized existed. And so over the last several years, I've partnered across local, provincial, and national youth engagement surrounding healthcare and health sciences. Just a few of the things that I've gotten to do: national research networks, many research projects, as well as scientific, strategical, clinical networks, advisory councils on provincial and local healthcare systems, where I've advised on strategic plans, partnered on research projects, and I actually co-created and co-chair a provincial strategic working group to address pediatric medical traumatic stress. And I wanted to mention these things to highlight the broad depth at which youth can be engaged in things when given the proper opportunity and guidance. There really isn't anything they can't do. So a framework that some organizations can use to meaningfully engage with youth is called the McCain Model of Youth Engagement. This was developed by the McCain Center at the Center for Addictions and Mental Health, and it has 4 key features. The first of which being flexibility. So basically this means that youth get to choose their level of engagement based upon their current capacity. This is fluid and subject to change. So for example, if you're a youth like myself, who's also a student, you might not be as available during exam months for super in-depth engagement. As well, there's mentorship. So this can take place in formal and informal, as well as professional development. As well, there's reciprocal learning. So this really challenges the traditional unilateral pedagogy of adult to young person, and it opens it up to be bilateral, meaning that the adult also gets to learn from the young person. So for example, something that often is learned is that Facebook is not the place to recruit young people for a research project. Finally, there's also authentic decision-making. So this means being an active member in the decision-making process, and being able to make decisions that are specifically regarding youth. So for example, as you mentioned about the color scheme, it was great that they asked the youth about the color scheme, but it didn't stop there at the color, right? Like, youth were involved throughout. They took the youth input more than just what color, but they wanted to figure out, how do we make this youth friendly? So now that you have a bit of background on me and a model of engagement, I'm going to switch my focus into a story that I feel best highlights the importance of meaningful youth engagement in policy. And this took place within the context of the creation of a provincial electronic medical health record system that patients and parents could use to access their health information online at any time. So while creating this system, the province was challenged with trying to figure out at what age the proxy or access should be transferred from parent to youth. Initially, they thought 14 seemed like a pretty good age, but although they thought 14 seemed like a pretty good age, they also recognized, hey, we should probably get some youth input on this because they are going to be the end user. And to do this, they connected with the 2 children's hospitals in the province and their youth advisory councils, as well as the Provincial Youth Addictions and Mental Health Council. And I want to note here that they didn't just have one conversation or presentation. It was months and months of ongoing, continuing engagement coming back time and time again, because they really wanted to make sure that the youth voice and input was reflected in the policy. So surprising to some, when they consulted with the youth felt that 14 is not a good age. They thought that was too late. And the youth actually spoke about the very high likelihood for young people to avoid care, specifically regarding things like sexual health, gender-affirming care, potential abuses that may be happening, as well as addictions and mental health supports. I found it very powerful, actually, when I was in on that conversation. Several youth spoke about how if this was in place right now, they simply would not go for care because they'd be in major trouble at home. I also do want to mention that they did consult with parents because it has to be a balance here, right? And not surprisingly, the parents felt 14 was too early and 16 was more appropriate. And so after many consults over many months, it was ultimately decided that at age 12, the proxy would be frozen for 1 year. Now, during this year, they still have access to their health records through traditional methods, like going into the hospital and asking for them. But this way, when the youth turn 13, they are now in charge of their access to health information. This doesn't mean the parent can't have access as well, because that's obviously a very anxiety-provoking thought. But rather, it's at the decision of the youth to share, because they don't want to share all personal things. If a 13 or 14-year-old is sexually active, they might not want their parents to know that. And so, in this case, consulting with youth potentially prevented an unforeseeable amount of young people to go without care, and specifically surrounding abuse and addictions and mental health, I would offer at times life-saving care. The youth had the ability to see around corners that adults just didn't in this situation, and that's okay. And although a 2-year difference between 12 and 14 may not seem like that big of a deal, if you ask the youth who it would severely impact, 2 years makes a world of difference. So before I finish off, I want to equip you with a few practical pieces of advice regarding youth engagement and policy. So first, recognizing intersectionality among youth. Youth is just an age range. It is in no means a descriptor of who an entire person is. Each of us here are youth, and we all bring different perspectives and different expertise. So for example, if there was a new health program targeting Indigenous youth, it would be very inappropriate for me to be the youth advisor on that. As well, being cautious of tokenism. It does often happen unintentionally, but nonetheless it happens. And so in the story that I shared, the healthcare system prevented this by continually coming back and making sure that the youth input was actually placed within the policy as well. So recognize youth engagement not as an afterthought or something to just check the box. I know some grant applications require patient partners now. But rather engage with them right from the beginning. It does produce better results in policy. I'll leave you with this to ponder throughout the day. Consider the differences it might make in your own work if we shifted the traditional mindset of creating policy or conducting research on youth to creating policy and conducting research with youth. I promise it will make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. That was amazing. I picked up a lot of different things from your presentation. You talked about the importance of consulting youth, including them right from the beginning, intersectionality, issues around tokenism, and hopefully we can explore some of these concepts in our question and answer period. So now we will actually move into our question and answer period. Hopefully we will be able to see the questions that have come into the app on the screen in just a moment. And please feel free to continue submitting your questions on the app. If you would prefer to come to the mic to ask your question, you're also welcome to do that. So if anyone has any questions right now, we can start taking questions for the panelists. So just as we wait for the questions to come up on the screen, yes, thank you.
Is this working? Yeah? Okay. So thanks so much for the panel. It was really interesting to hear all of your perspectives. I have a question about how would you encourage or how would you suggest to get youth excited about science policy? I think it's easy for ways to think about getting kids excited about research. I mean, I have a 5-year-old, we make a volcano, it's very exciting, but you can't really, how would you translate that to science policy and maybe how did you get excited about working in the science policy area?
Okay. I think for me personally, I think that engagement from like people who are more experienced really helped for me because as like a 15-year-old, as someone who feels like they really don't have a say in what's going on in the world very much, it was really nice to see someone who was very experienced. My mentor, Dr. Mark Jaffe, was actually very, very helpful in the whole process of me doing my project. And it was just really, really reassuring that it was someone who had a lot of experience in the field who was listening to what I had to say as a kid who is interested in this thing. So I think that if a lot of more experienced people did just try to engage or even just try to pay attention to these younger people who might be a bit interested in like this STEM sort of career, then yeah, we would see a lot more active youth engagement.
I would love to share that for kind of my experience engaging youth and then my experience being engaged as well. So I feel like a lot of times with youth, as Rachel mentioned really eloquently, is you look at policy and you don't necessarily feel that there's a place for you there. It feels like a lot of things you can't really see the impact of, although they impact your everyday life. And it's really kind of bridging the gap and translating that understanding that these are how policies will be impacted. Sarah also made a great point in talking about involvement through the whole process. And a big thing that motivates people to keep engaging is seeing that impact, seeing the changes made because of their time spent in 20 Zoom meetings, seeing that integrated into the final process, and seeing that impact again being translated and actually cared about by policymakers. So Rachel mentioned like mentorship, and I think all of us here have been mentored by different scientists in the field, postdocs, graduate students, people in community engagement like Laura, and that mentorship really builds that passion and fuel for us to keep engaging in policy work in particular.
I think the other thing I'll touch about on that is you mentioned volcanoes. So that's the tangible thing that we can see and get excited about. And I think if we can figure out ways to create, as was mentioned, tangible examples of how policy does influence your everyday life, getting youth to talk about what they're passionate about, what issues they're passionate about, and then explaining how these issues, if they're addressed, can be addressed through policy. So creating tangible examples.
If I could jump in as well. Excellent answers, team. This is a great question, how to get people excited. Volcanoes, easy example. For the science, how did you do it for the science policy? For me, in space, astronomy is the gateway science. That's how people get into it, and they keep asking questions from there. And so one direct question I ask related to this is I ask people, like, promote the question, how do we decide what we study? Should we go to the moon? Should we go to Mars? And then, kids will argue with each other all day about that, and it's really fun. But using that as an avenue to explore, hey, there are people who have to decide this, and there are different mechanisms to do so. Thanks for the question.
Thank you, panelists. Thank you. We have another question from the audience.
Yes, so I work in research communication, so promoting the great research you're doing, and you're amazing. So I wanted your opinion on how we should better communicate research to your generation, your audience. Or do you have any suggestions?
First of all, thank you so much for your work in SciComm or science communication. It's so fundamental to that youth engagement piece. And I think all of us here have definitely experienced the highs and lows of SciComm and that experience. I definitely think youth are not on Facebook, as Sarah mentioned. So finding and consulting youth in that process. We actually have an active youth advisory that helps us refine all our content and make sure it's as youth friendly as possible. We use lots of GIFs, lots of creating with them on like diagrams that could explain these concepts and conceptual things. We use a lot of analogies to explain a lot of these things. And I think a big part of some of the very impactful science communicators on TikTok and on Instagram has been really staying integrated into the youth community. So really hearing about what issues are impacting our lives, what we care about learning, and thinking about how the research you do can impact that. So at Sick Kids, we actually have a few different social media accounts that we use to kind of engage with our youth. So our lab, for example, has a Instagram account, and we have like a group of wonderful youth that help us create content for it, and we kind of oversee it and be there to support them, help them edit, refine their ideas. But really that generation comes from the youth themselves. Also, knowing when a trend is over, I think is really important. I'll just like throw that out there, like, knowing when it's the meme is no longer memeing, I think is an important fact as well. But I'd love to pass it off if anyone else has anything to add. Yeah, go for it.
I think again, this piece of explaining what impact you would have is really important, because I think that sort of the stereotype on like teenagers especially is that we just like don't really care. We do care a lot, especially if we can like actually see what we could bring to the table. Because again, what I said before is a lot of younger people feel like their voice isn't typically recognized as much in the conversation because we are young, because we are experienced. So I think just really making sure that younger people know that they do have something to bring to the table and that people will listen to them is really, really important.
Thank you so much. Now I would like to read a question off of the conference app. So the most popular right now is, what are some signs of tokenism when it comes to involving youth in research and policy? What are some ways that researchers and policymakers can avoid tokenism? So if anyone wants to start. Thank you, Vina.
Thanks, Eki. So definitely a really important question, and I really applaud the audience for caring about this because it is something that impacts kind of a smaller group of us, and it is really impactful in our future experiences engaging with science again. So I've definitely been tokenized. I check a lot of boxes. I live with, I have a disability. I came from poverty, child of immigrants, like, et cetera, et cetera. I definitely still have a lot of privilege, though, which I always try to recognize as well. But I've definitely been invited to the table and not necessarily there to really speak, but just represent quietly. And I think a big part of this is engaging with new youth, is that when we are tokenized and our voice isn't heard, we will not engage again. And this is particularly true from racialized groups, from Indigenous groups, from, folks with disabilities. And a lot of times, although it's very important to include partners equitably, it's also incredibly important to genuinely hear them, learn more about them than the boxes that they tick, learn about, I'm a Raptors fan, you can comment on that. And there's a bunch of other ways where you can really create meaningful connection. And that is really the way to avoid tokenizing. Also, we are experts in our lived experience. And that's a whole, I could probably have a PhD in pain management and living with a disability by now. But it's really important to understand that that is its own version of expertise, and that impacts the way we navigate the world. And when you are engaging, it's incredibly important to remember, as Sarah mentioned, intersectionality. And while we tick those boxes, we're also people, just regular people, just like you. And our voice matters at that table. And again, it's incredibly important to hear that voice because there's a reason you need to tick that box.
That there's a reason you need to tick that box. So you just said about being invited to the table. I think the best example of tokenism I can think of is being invited to the table but not having a voice to speak. I think that accurately depicts what tokenism can be. So, and like I said, I do want to mention this is often unintentional. I don't think anybody sets out to tokenize youth. But like I said, being invited to the table but not being able to speak. So what can we do to prevent that? Coming back to the youth, like I mentioned in my story, continually engaging, not just getting some input and then like, okay, thanks, bye. That doesn't feel very good. I think,
Thank you, Sarah and Vina. Those were some really excellent answers. And I could just add to, I think it's really important not to go to the same youth all the time and to outreach and to reach out to other members of similar communities, just so that we're avoiding the whole notion of tokenism. So thank you.
Nice.
Yes, please. The floor is
So I have a question for you. Maybe you can help me with a problem that we're trying to solve. So I come from Labs Canada, and we're looking at the federal labs across the country. And most of these labs were built from the 40s to the 70s. They're tired. We're trying to figure out how do you attract and retain the new generation of scientists. It sounds easier than it really is, because we brought these. For example, there was some young geologists that were going into the NRCan building, which is natural resources. And they were all excited about being a geologist. They saw the dingy old building, not really reflective of the excellence and the caliber of the science that might be occurring in it. They saw the kind of stuffy old scientists. I hope none of them are here that would take offense to that. But you know what I mean? Like they changed their mind right there on the spot, these two students. And they said, you know what? I don't want to be a geologist anymore. And that's, so the state of the infrastructure is one. So we're trying to come up with a way to maybe assess all these labs. So there's about 409 that are kind of in our scope across the country. And in these labs, some of them got some really cool science in it, like the space agency ones and some of the anechoic chamber kind of stuff, but others are like that in our CAN geology lab. And then on top of that, even the science community themselves are kind of saying, scientists don't care about the space. They want to follow who is going for the next Nobel Prize and the sexy science stuff. And I don't know if that's entirely true. I think that there's all these other equations to it. So if I wanted to create some sort of a program to assess my labs, how good are they? How would I do that?
I would say get a youth advisory council. So similar to what ITSE has done, like you said, some things are easier said than done. Recruiting out to young scientists, people who are working in these areas, even if they haven't reached a point in their career yet where they're working in the lab, I think it could also be provide some valuable input to have that fresh perspective come in, like you just said about the two geologists who walked in. Okay, no, never mind. So yeah, engaging youth and creating a council or group or panel that can stay with you throughout.
One thing I just want to add, I forgot, is that I hired Angela Carabeo from Alberta, yeah. So just to say, so
Welcome.
I've got one who can help me, and maybe she's my inspire. So I'd love for connecting.
Awesome, thank you so much.
I can kind of speak about this and our work to bring life back to our research building at Sick Kids. So we got a few years ago, what people were researching in is very different than the building we have right now, which was through a generous donation by Peter Gilligan. But we were able to kind of build this state-of-the-art research institute. And wow, when high school students come in there, it's really easy to convince them to get into science. And when they see, in a way, the infrastructure shows that there's support from the institution. And then we feel valued and seen, and especially when you add in some little perks like an area where you can meditate or pray or just have times for silence and away from everybody, and like really co-design the space, it's incredibly important. So we're doing this right now at Sick Kids. We're actually rebuilding our main hospital, and we actually have healthcare professionals. You wouldn't need those, but you would need the scientists and hear their needs. You would hear the youth and what they thought of everything, and the young scientists. And then you'd also talk to, other individuals like at perhaps the institution to learn more about institutional policies and what they have the capacity for. I think knowing that change is coming is a huge motivator. I've definitely stuck it out in some pretty old buildings where we had to set rat traps and things like that, in the hope that we were getting this new building and that the institution was going to support us to this next level. So I definitely think that's a really important question, and I think there's Max can definitely provide some insight as well. But from our perspective and what we're doing, get that youth advisory, that young generation of scientists, and involve them in really co-designing the space, because it doesn't only have to be input from kind of one source downwards. It can be something that we contribute to together.
Thank you, Vina, for that answer. And thank you very much for that question. Like, it's a big problem. It's not something we're going to solve in the few minutes allotted to the question. But I just really want to applaud your approach of not blaming it on the youth, not taking the kids these days approach. Like, so genuinely, thank you very much. Coming to these panels, asking that question, building a team as your organization is doing to address that is exactly the right approach. And that's something the gentleman in front of you, Paul DeFore from the Office of the Chief Science Advisor, also believes in, bringing in young people because they see the improvements, see the benefit of adding additional perspectives to the conversation. So thank you very much for taking the approach you are doing.
Thank you, Max. Oh, yes.
I just wanted to add, this was not scripted. I hope you can see the benefit of asking. We're just like 4 people here. We're just 4 youth. But if you got a youth advisory council and if you got younger people's input, I hope you can like really see the importance of engaging these young people in anything that you do. Yeah. So thank you for the question.
Yes, thank you for the question. And I think we got some really great responses from the panelists. And I think it also kind of feeds into the stereotypes of what a scientist is, how they look like, where they work. And I think what you have is a very powerful opportunity to change that around and work with youth to co-design the space. And yeah, there's just so many different ways that things can change. So Vina mentioned things like a place to meditate, pray, even like having like a separate lounge for just like, having breaks and taking lunch, having arts. So these are just some of the ways that that the space can look a little bit different. So thank you. Yep. Sorry. Go ahead, please.
Also, just quickly adding accessibility. So I, as somebody who lives with a disability, if I walk into a space and I'm like, yeah, there's no way I can get through this day in the space, like bright overhead fluorescent lights are my nightmare, and I think they're everyone's nightmare. But things like that, and considering that accessibility and equity piece to everything you do, like, so any youth has the potential to engage and has the potential for a career in science without thinking about the limits of living with painful or chronic conditions.
Thank you, Vina. And then one last point on what Sarah mentioned earlier. I was actually going to say that, but then Sarah said it about youth advisory councils. And I think they're such a great idea. And we can definitely see the benefits and the impacts that has had on us that are a part of youth advisory councils. And they're a really great initiative. But one thing that people should know is that it is an investment. It's an investment of time, resources, and we're so lucky to be in a country that really values the future of youth. And so there are so many grants out there that are geared towards youth who are interested in STEM. And I think that is a really good opportunity to take advantage of and apply for those grants, and just consider how you can use it towards bringing on board youth advisors into your work. So,
an investment, not an expense, just to highlight.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. Okay, so I will read off the next most popular question on the app. So, how can we create more inclusive and equitable environments for diverse youth to engage in youth research or in science research and policy?
Take a roll at it. This is a really great question, so thank you so much to whoever inputted this into the app. So I think a big part is recognizing, especially for diverse youth that you would like to engage, are some of the potential barriers they might face. Some of us are caregivers to aging parents. That's a consideration you might want to think about, is like potential caregiving expenses, access to technology, being able to translate your material into different languages, because again, we have tons of diverse youth ready and willing to engage in research. But again, it's just those barriers to engagement that stop them right at the door. I think creating programming where we are engaging young scientists like Rachel, and recognizing them as a scientist for all the work you've done, because there are definitely scientists that I work with that I don't think could do some of the things you did. So, I definitely think like those are some of the really important elements, and going where youth are. I think a lot of times there's this idea that like, oh, nobody wants to join my committee. Oh no, I put it out on Twitter and that must be where all the youth are. Like, that's not where we are. And I think like and I'm a millennial, I'm not even Gen Z. Like so I definitely defer to Rachel on that. But, we're not there. And it's important to understand that like when you're truly looking for partnership and engagement, you come where we are, you create a space where we feel heard, where we feel valued, where, you make sure you ask everyone their accessibility requirements. So some people, again, might need breaks, might need a space for quiet, for sensory overload, for a lot of those things. And it's incredibly important to recognize those barriers and make sure we allocate resources to overcoming that. And that will really create a safe space where diverse youth really can shine and engage the way we want them to.
Just, I'll touch on that a little bit about disability. So I technically do have a disability. It definitely interferes with my day-to-day life, and there are things that I have to make accommodations for. So for example, I would not be able to stand for 20 minutes to give a talk. I needed to sit. And I'll be honest, going into my nursing career, even in research, I don't see people with even chronic health conditions reflected. And so that right off the bat can be a deterrent, right? Like, can I do this? I don't see anyone that has similar experiences as me. So I think creating opportunities to highlight those people with lived experience who are engaged in research and are researchers, and allowing those to be examples for younger people to see that, hey, you are included in this. There's no reason why you shouldn't be able to pursue what you want to pursue.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you. And just extending from this question, I know, Vina, you talked about accessibility and just, making way for that. Are there like non-financial ways to compensate youth for their engagement and their co-designing of different projects?
Thank you so much, Eki. And thanks for giving me an opportunity to plug what I was talking about earlier. So we recently were funded in the Ontario Child Health Support Unit to do a conference to kind of envision the future of patient partnership. I want to say partnership in research. A lot of the organizations are still using patient-oriented, but we're really trying to move away from that language. And then also say people with lived experience to include the diverse experience of caregivers, of siblings, of kind of everyone involved in the circle of care. So in terms of what we're doing, working with actually a few of the youth on the youth advisory, they came to me and they said, Vina, like, why can't I get course credit for the work I do with you? It's way more complicated than what I would do in my spare. It's valid. You give me opportunities to learn and grow. I'm creating content for social media, translating really complex pain neuroscience. Like, why can't this be a credit? And I was like, you know what? You're right. So we put our policy hats on and we're writing to the government of Ontario and the Ministry of Education to try to get these opportunities recognized for what they are. And imagine if every person had that opportunity for research engagement in high school where you got course credit for working in a lab. That would fuel the next generation of science. Like, it's amazing the work that even Rachel and Sarah have been able to do as young people, and especially like without that funding or those opportunities, Rachel took it upon herself to learn Python. Like, nobody told her to do that. And if she had that opportunity to get course credit for it, like, that'd be awesome, right? And winning a science fair and all those things. So we're definitely working hard to recognize that there are ways we can, first of all, compensation's key to equitable research. So I'm not saying you should not compensate, but there might be ways to compensate in ways that are more relevant to youth and their experience every day. So yeah, thanks for giving me a chance to talk about that.
Thank you. That was an amazing response. So we're just going to open it up again to the audience. If you have any questions, if you don't want to come to the mic, that's fine too. Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Hi, thank you all for sharing your stories and your experience. I'm actually working with Natural Resources right now in their youth council that they're developing. And it's really exciting to see the youth engagement in politics. And as a youth myself, like I'm only 26. And what I like to see about it is that we all feel like that's social justice and we want to disrupt the status quo for change. But we're also seeing the popularity of youth councils at Natural Resources, Environment and Climate Change, Chief Scientist, and it's great. But what else can we do to engage youth in politics to see that policy involvement and really get the science integrated into the policy in the House and the Senate and at different levels of government as well? I'm interested to hear your takes.
Sorry, I always have to wait because it takes a while. I think that one thing is that for a lot of people, science isn't really associated with policy. Just like there's sort of like this binary assumption that you can either be an artist or you can be a scientist. You can be good at English or you can be good at math. You can't be good at both, right? So I think that it's really important that people recognize that science and policy are sort of inherently interconnected, and that people see this relationship between the two. And then I think that's where the actual integration of what you're talking about comes in. And again, just coming back, I know I'm always talking about this, but I think you really have to make sure that youth can see what they're doing, what they bring to the table, because it feels really not very good when you're going to like a Zoom meeting or something. You kind of just sit there and you listen to all the adults talking. You're kind of just like there. So yeah, again, it's really, really important that young people can actually see what they're bringing to the table.
I was recently a research assistant on a youth mental health promotion through policy project. So it was where youth were taught a little bit about policy making, and then they got to identify a problem within their community that they could address through policy change. This was youth initiated, deciding which challenge to tackle. An example I can give is we had a cohort in rural northern BC, and they didn't have any community centers really, and so there wasn't much for the youth to do. At night, they kind of just hang out, sometimes drink, but in all honesty, there was nothing else to do there. And so when these youth were engaged and they learned about policy, they felt empowered, and they went to their community council and asked for a community center to be built. And so I would offer that chance right there probably got them a lot more interested in policy and was a real life example of the difference that not only they can make, but the difference that policy makes in life as well.
Sorry, Sarah, that's a really great example. And I would love to see examples like this really highlighted and amplified. I think all four of us have really great examples of policy and work we've done and real world impact, but there's not really, it's not like everybody or all youth know about this or know about the impact they can make themselves. So I think there's a really important part of this is modeling and really showing what's been done and what we can do, and really encouraging blue sky thinking. A lot of times we're shut down right away with ideas and our knowledge of policy, when you think about it, for most people is their grade 10 civics and careers class, which is split halfway, where you have to make a CV with one half and then you're learning about the government in another half, which really isn't enough time to understand policy or the impact. So that's why I think projects like Sarah, where you're educating, is going to be a huge part in engaging the next generation. And a lot of things feel so insurmountable as a teenager. You're like, I have no power in this society. I don't have a million letters behind my name. How can I make a difference? And really understanding that there are youth right now with not a million qualifications, and all they really have is their lived experience, but they're being mentored and shown how they can impact things. In my community, for example, recently a youth actually even ran for council, and it was really empowering because they were 21 and they were really trying to make a difference. And I think it really helped educate and spread that message that youth can be involved in politics, and that policy, politics, research, they're all all connected, and understanding the relationship between the three. Because I think, as mentioned earlier, it's really easy to get people into the research side of things. Actually, that's not always true, but for a good percentage of times, it's easier to get people into research, which I've seen. But it's a lot harder when I say, "Hey, I'm on a task force, and I would really like your help doing X, Y, Z," and they're like, "Vina, there's no point to this. Nothing will come of your report." But I think showing people that things will come of it, that change is in the air, and that we have people in power right now who are willing to think about science in the next generation and give us a platform to share our impact as individuals and really how that's impacted the community at large. So those are just my thoughts.
Thank you, Vina. Thank you. And thank you, Rachel. I really like how you guys highlighted that different fields are interconnected, and that's really important to remember and take away. So we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. We just want to give the audience some space. If there's any last questions before we wrap up? Yes, please. Yes.
So, 2. You want to go first? I already had it.
I have a comment, so maybe that's a good one. I mean, just speaking on behalf of me, you are an inspiration. I feel very confident. We are in good hands, and you are going to lead us in good directions. So thank you. I've taken notes. I have some ideas to bring back to our own organization. So again, just kudos to all of you guys. Which organization is it? BioCanRx. We work in healthcare, cancer immunotherapy, and so I have really poignant points that you guys made. So I'll come find you after if you're around. Thank you.
So my question is another of seeking advice on the universal accessibility and the wellness and that sort of thing. So yes, that's another data layer that we're developing. So in that data layer, we've got a lot of blocks, I would say, in terms of, like looking for the simple way. The first one is, the engineers and architects that are kind of checking the condition of the building say, well, just let the BCR guys, the building condition people do it. They don't get it. Secondly, what's really different in a science type of facility, and then everyone goes in and immediately pictures wheelchairs, and they get the Rick Hansen, which is great for those with physical disabilities that require a wheelchair, but there's a lot of other different types. That's not even very many of them, right? So that's trying to break through that, and then even reaching further back is how many people just assume they could never work and never even try, never even start down that path. And how would you even measure that? I don't know. And then just in terms of building the case to take it out and then apply it specifically to science types of infrastructure. Everyone pictures lobbies and front entrances and washrooms, but there's other types in science infrastructure. So that's another thing we're working on that we could use some advice.
Thank you for your question. And I think this is incredibly important because, like Sarah mentioned, I was very much the same way. I didn't know I could until I walked into a space and I was like, this might actually be possible for me. I might actually have a supportive environment where I can truly shine and actually contribute because I'm not so worried about meeting my physical requirements that I need. And I think that, again, like this is where I think the communication piece definitely plays a role, is when you let people know that it's out there, people will usually try to come if they can. So if you let people know, like, this is the world's most accessible lab, like, I definitely think there will be, there are important facets to that, because even at our hospital, we didn't, in our like research institute, maybe about 5 years ago, we did not take into account everything that needed to be taken account into for accessibility. Our new kind of atrium hospital patient care center is going to look completely different and feel completely different, because what they did is they actually involved youth in those consultations. So I think the ideas and the infrastructure and understanding that disability is not, there are many, many facets to disability. It's not just always needing a wheelchair, and like breaking that assumption is very powerful. And I think letting people know that you could have a sensory disability, or you can have, processing, or like a kind of neurodivergence, or a million and one different things. But understanding that just like healthcare should be precise and suited and customized for an individual, so should a work environment, and so should a research lab. And I think, having, for us in a digital health lab, like not having the computers to have the capacity to do what we need to do is incredibly frustrating, and makes me think about walking out of the office every single day. Or, walking across the wet lab space, like seeing what they're dealing with every day in the basic science world, knowing that I work with countless other youth who have disabilities who can't pipette for hours and do certain tasks, or they need seating that can be adjusted, like a sit-stand desk. And I think what's interesting is the pandemic really forced people to learn about what they needed in a work environment so they could adapt that for their home not everybody, but, the people who had the privilege to work from home during the pandemic. But learning about those kind of barriers, again, doing that work to prioritize and set areas, and, even sending out a survey like through CIHR, NSERC, and like learning about the scientists, or even utilizing like the professional organizations. So like Canadian Pain Society, full of researchers, trainees, like them disseminating your survey, kind of prioritizing that using a Delphi method, and really, I'm going into methodology now, but there are lots of different ways we can learn about the best ways to do things that involves some qualitative work as well. So really learning those pieces.
You got the qualitative part, the survey part, and the modified Delphi part. So if you want some more backing as to like, why is this actually important? Because, of course we can talk about feelings and you want to feel inclusive, but what's the actual evidence or reason behind it? I'm a big fan of qualitative. I know not everyone is, but I think interviewing people who are in those labs, young people, as well as surveys, like was mentioned, can help you get some data around perceptions and possible barriers as well. And you can even include like suggestions for recommendations for change as well. That might be helpful.
My apologies. I just wanted to make a quick comment, and I really very much enjoyed your superb backgrounds experience, lived experience, which of course is so important. But I just wanted to make a comment about inclusive, which I think is such an important issue. It's not just inclusive in society, because of course science is a social activity, right, at the end of the day. It's also about being inclusive in the perspective you bring to the science youth perspective, which means, of course, bringing in not just the sciences, entre guillemets, but also, of course, the arts, culture, music. These are important facets that can influence and help shape public policy in a much more meaningful way, because after all, you're going to make the difference for this planet in many, many different ways, and you can bring that to the table. So I just wanted to underscore inclusive can also mean the very changing nature of science itself, which includes, of course, its social activity. Thank you.
For sure. Thank you so much, sir. Yeah. If I could just add something, so I'm a very solitary person. I'm like very introverted. And a few months ago, my dad, he's right there. He told me, that like 100 years ago, science was just something. Science was something that like a guy could develop in his basement. Like Einstein just sort of sat there and thought to himself and was like, oh my God, relativity theorem, right? It's not like that anymore. We really need to work together as humans. We have to, again, science is a very social thing, right? And being able to recognize that younger people are eventually the ones who are going to take over the thing someday, is very, very important. And then also to add, just an example of like how gearing things more towards youth, or just even making it more accessible towards youth, really, really works. So before like the 40s, I want to say, the fashion industry was really geared towards like middle-aged people, and like a lot of these commercials were like, oh, are you going shopping for Thanksgiving? I don't even know. So it was, so it was very geared towards like the older generation. And then once television became like more of a mainstream thing, then all these younger people suddenly got more interested into fashion, and they're like, oh, this is super cool, and I like choosing shirts for myself, and so now we can see that fashion is very much geared towards younger people, right? So this is the exact same thing with science. If we can make this more accessible for younger people, if we can show them why this is really interesting, and again show them why policy is so interesting, and show them how they can actually impact the world and how they can be integrated with this whole thing. It's very, very important. It actually works really well.
Yes, sorry. Go ahead. Thanks, Rachel. That's, as always, insightful and so meaningful. And Gen Z, like, you guys got it. In terms of what I think is really interesting is the shift in the culture for science. So, for example, right now we're applying for a team science grant in implementation science, which involves like 10 other specialties from like different universities all across Canada with different expertise, and thinking through like having a sociologist on our team for some of this implementation work, and recognizing that yes, psychology, sociology, music, there's so much science to this, like, and I think the diverse perspectives only create better research. So I definitely think what's great is policy and funding has shifted in a way that requires you to work together, that requires collaboration. And I think that will only move us forward and really kind of like catapult us into the next area of science.
Okay, I just wanted to add something onto a question that we had before. So I think you were asking about like what other structures we could add to places just to make them more engaging towards youth. So like other than just like adding washrooms and wheelchairs and stuff. I think something is you could possibly think of adding just like a lounge, because a lot of younger people are like a lot more relaxed. I want to say that sounds kind of derogatory. I don't mean it like that, but I actually had like a really big argument with my mom before coming here, because I wanted to dress a lot more casual and she wanted me to dress a lot more fancy. This is what we ended up with, but a lot of younger people are really like, just we're all friends. It's all good. We're chill. It's very relaxed. So I think that just having just like a lounge where people can hang out and not be super uptight and talk in fancy words is very good for younger people. So like, again, I just want to say younger people, we're very, very relaxed people. Like we literally sign emails off with like memes, like quotes from memes rather than saying regards. So just keeping that in mind, when you want to engage youth, you don't always have to be so like, dear Rachel, I am pleased to inform, just like be chill, yeah.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you. I second that. So, so thank you guys so much for engaging with our panel. We do want to bring this to a close. We do have a final poll question for you, which is going to show up on the screen, and you can access the poll through the conference app. So our closing poll question is, after today's session, which of the following best describes your plans to engage with youth in the future? A, I am less likely to engage with youth. B, no change to my plans to engage with youth. Or C, I am more likely to engage with youth. So we are going to just see the results as they come in. And most people say I am more likely to engage with youth, which is awesome because that was the objective of our session. So thank you so much. We do have a resource sheet that we compiled for you. It should show on the screen, and you can click on the QR code, or we can also circulate it through the conference organizers. And our email for CIHR ITSE is also on the screen, as well as our Twitter handle, so feel free to connect with us there. And thank you all so much once again, and we hope that you enjoy the rest of the conference.